Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
I hope everybody is good.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
So
please.
generally, how are things going? Reading, preparation for the quiz and for the end of semester. How are things going?
Sir, please, we are still on it.
Abigail, your voice is very low.
Sir, please, we are still on it. It's been cool so far.
Okay. And my assignment, I think you guys are wrapping up. Stanley, what about what we have done? Are you not seeing top? Stanley, Akwete. Stanley, you can talk. We want to hear your voice. Okay, so I have already specified the quiz areas. It's on your platform. By just repeating for the sake of emphasis. It is going to, I've even forgotten of what I typed myself. Let me go back to your page. So we can all see it together. Okay, so this is the post. Quiz 2 is scheduled for next week, but I mean next week at the time I was doing this post actually is actually this week. And from your course rep, I got the information that you prefer to take the quiz the following week, which is going to be next week. I'm still waiting to receive concrete information regarding the specific day within next week, the time and venue. The earlier you give us that information, the better for our planning as the examination team. So the areas were audit planning and risk assessment, audit committee and internal control, corporate governance. So 3 areas. And through the assignment, I think you should have already read through
Sir,
corporate
please,
governance.
I'm not hearing you.
Hello?
Come again.
Please, I can hardly hear you. Who is speaking? Etuahene. Hello? Abigail. Hello, Abigail.
This is our facility manager. Sorry. Yes. This one of our lectures.
Good afternoon. Yes, sir.
Yes. centralize their information. Okay. So, how are you? You are waiting for business.
Hello, class. Can you hear me? Hello, if you can hear me, you can hear me,
Okay,
right?
sure, you can hear you.
Okay, I was thinking I have a problem with the connectivity because there's one lady who speaks that I can't hear, Abigail. So I was trying to figure out if the problem wasn't coming from my side. If you can hear me, that is cool. So those are the areas you should read on for the quiz. And we also have to be mindful that the time from the second quiz to the main exam is just, I mean, it's a very short time. That's what it is. So when we are reading, we should read as if you're even going to write the end of semester. We should prepare. If you have not started preparing already, start today. Start today and read that tomorrow you are going to write the end of semester. I have posted sample tutorials. I will see, yeah, it depends on time. In fact, that is what I must do, but my main challenge is time. I will try my hardest to provide tutorials to some of them, if not all of them. Some of them, if not all of them, so that it can assist you in your approach. Sometimes the experience I have is that students generally can understand the concepts, but the detail at which even the styling of writing, I mean, their answers, which is required by this subject area, is somehow lacking because they are not exposed to many past questions. So those who actually learn with past questions get exposed to, if you learn the past questions with recommended answers, that's what I mean. You get exposed to the requirement in terms of how to write it. And the textbook I gave you, very standard textbook. It's a global standard textbook. So when you read the concept, at the tail of the book, you have questions bank, answers bank. So you can take one question, one standard question, which is case. And after you yourself have tried answering the questions based on your own confidence level, later go to the answer bank and locate solution to that question and read through the solution and notice the detail of the analysis. That is what the examiner wants you to write. That's how he wants you to write it. So when you begin to do that, you begin to also learn the style of writing, the level of display of skill, and all those things. They are all part of the things you are supposed to learn. So please learn with past questions. I've put some questions already on your platforms. A lot of questions are at the tail of the textbook with answers. Read, try to solve most of them, get yourself exposed to the writing style, how you provide your solution, and so on and so forth. Okay. Before we start today, as someone said, I should repeat the areas. Let's just show the screen so you can see for yourself. I think the text can be very, let me try to see. No, the text is naturally smaller. So I'll read. Coverage, audit planning and risk assessment. That is one topic. So you can find that topic in the textbook I gave you. Read and try to solve some questions from the question and answer bank. If you haven't started doing that today, start learning like that. The other area is audit committee and internal control. I posted a separate note on audit committee on your platform. Get it if you don't have it already. Internal control, we did the lecture together. The video for the lecture is uploaded on your YouTube channel. If you have decided not to be on the channel, find a way to get the information. And the last area is corporate governance. So these are the areas you should read for in preparation for the quiz next week. Any questions before we start today's topic? Any questions? Okay, no questions. Let's go ahead. Internal control system. As part of our learning of auditing, we have come to the realization that companies are set up, first of all, to provide value for those who set it up. Even those working in it, if they are not the people who own it, they also have an interest. Society at large has an interest in companies when they are formed. It's not only for the person or the people who formed it. And for that reason, much is done to protect the company from collapsing, from doing bad. In fact, the opposite is also true. Much is done to guide the company or the business towards a successful future. So, if you remember, we read a few history about collapses of companies, businesses, and it is worrying some for everyone. In some jurisdiction, they have even taken the decision to imprison the people who caused the collapse of the companies. And some of them were in prison for 25 years. Here in Ghana, when the banking crisis hit us, and notable banks collapsed, and through the exercise by the Bank of Ghana, some of them need to be actually brought down, taken over, some need to merge. All of us were disturbed because jobs were lost. And we were asking ourselves questions. So what went wrong? Because it's expected that all must be done to protect the company to a good future. Okay. So many things are done, and we have learned a lot of things that have been done, corporate governance concepts, external auditing concepts, and so on and so forth. Inside the company itself, much is always done. When company is set up, much is always done to protect the company, to keep the company on track towards a better future. A totality of all the things, policy-wise, procedures-wise, instructions, everything that is done to make sure that the company is always on track towards a successful future is what we describe as internal control system. We heard something partly about it in our previous lectures. So today we'll talk somehow detailed about it. So I have given some working definition of internal control, the totality of all the things that we need to do to make sure that the organization is on a successful track towards a successful future. The totality of that is the internal control system. So let's see how one notable source, we'll talk about that source very soon. And in fact, it's one of the major things we'll be talking about. One major source, let's see how it defines internal control system. It will not be too different from how we have already defined it. Any difference might be by the words that we have chosen to use. So I'm quoting from the Committee of Sponsoring Organization. You will very soon come to know of that long name, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. In short, we call it COSO, C-O-S-O. This is how they define internal control system. Internal control or internal control system is the process designed, implemented, and maintained by those charged with governance. That's the board of directors, management, and other personnel to provide reasonable assurance about the achievement of the entity's objectives with regard to, and they are making some specific areas that the internal control should target. With regard to reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So that's how COSO defines it. And it is the same as we said. The difference lies in just the words. COSO's definition is somehow specific. Let me repeat the definition and explain some of the parts of the definition. A process designed, implemented, and maintained by the board of directors and management and other key personnel for such a system to provide reasonable assurance about the achievement of the entity's objectives. It could be the totality of the entity's objectives, but COSO is highlighting some key areas. Reliability of financial reporting, 1. Effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So what's the interest for the auditor? Because anything we do, this one is a key responsibility for management. It's the primary responsibility of management to design, implement, and maintain the internal control system. That's the primary responsibility of management. How do auditors come in? You remember when we were doing risk assessment, we said that the auditor needs to preliminarily assess the level of control at the planning stage, the level of risk at the planning stage, so that that information can inform the approach to the audit. And part of the risk that he should assess is controlled risk. And controlled risk was defined as the risks that the entity's internal control system, and now we have some understanding of what an internal control system is. So the risk that the entity's internal control system is not able to do its job, is not able to prevent, detect, and deal with risk of error or fraud. That's what we call control risk. So the auditor needs to assess to be sure that the control risk is high or is low. He just needs to get the accurate understanding of what a control risk is. Is it high or low? High will mean that the control system, the internal control systems are not good. They are not working the way they should. Low means that almost everything is intact, except maybe minimal things. That has an effect on the approach that the auditor has to adopt in the audit. So that's why internal control system is important for the auditor, even though it is a primary responsibility of management to set it up, maintain it, and make it do the job that it's supposed to do. Now let's talk about COSO. There are a lot of internal control frameworks. And when you read most of the articles I give you for a term paper, you will realize that after serious investigations into the major corporate collapses, there were also serious attempts, both at governmental side, at regulatory body sides, to come up with certain ways of preventing that incidence. So in America, the government set up 5 key accountancy bodies in the US, including the American Accounting Association. And their job was to investigate major frauds and causes of collapses of companies and come up with ways of dealing with it. That committee that was set up to do that job was called Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. I have to correct one thing I said. In fact, this committee wasn't a government setup. The members of the committee sponsored themselves to set it up. So that is where the name derives from. Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. And they named it after the committee chairman, Treadway. So sometimes you will see it as Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. But in short, this is the name. This is how we often refer to it, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. The short form is COSO. So after their investigations and coming up with a recommendation, the recommendation document was referred to as, or they named the recommendation document, the document that contained the recommendations to solve the problem they were investigating, was titled as Internal Controls, Integrated Framework. You can try to search on the internet for this, Internal Control Integrated Framework. Any information you get from the internet will be relating this search to COSO. You can get, I think, the executive summary to download for free. But if you want a full document, I think it's available at COSO's website for sale for some dollars. You can get it and read. So they came up with a framework of making the internal connections, internal linkings, the internal stability of the company work solidly. Framework. And their framework was this: 5 interrelated components of internal control. And that is how come it is a system. That's how come it's an internal control system. It has 5 parts. So COSO came up with that framework that for a company's internal control system to be recognized as solid in design, it should have 5 interrelated components. And their components were: 1, control environment; 2, risk assessment; 3, control activities or control procedures; 4, information and communication; and lastly, monitoring. So these were the the framework for internal control proposed by COSO. And it has been the most recognized framework. In fact, all the other internal controls that maybe some companies may want to come, or some other regulatory bodies may want to come up with, you will find that the bedrock is this one. So this is the mother of all the frameworks. And most things that you will find from other frameworks are just a direct copy of this. That's the reason why we need to look at this framework. And the main thing is, as auditors, you need to have this understanding of what constitutes an effective internal control system, so that when you are doing the audit, you have a framework to assess the client's internal control system against. And not just to know about it, to know exactly what it means, what represents, for example, control environment, what represents, for example, risk assessment and all those things. You need to understand them practically. Don't just know about their definitions and leave as students. If you go that way, I would say you have robbed yourself. Okay, so let's look at each of the components. Each of the components. Control environment. Control. Let's try to get a meaning of the control environment from the first word. Control. When someone uses the word control, someone says control, what comes into your mind? Yes, I need you to participate in the lecture. What comes into your mind? "39 people in class." I think it will even be more than 39 because some of you will be pairing devices. I'm asking a simple question. I need a response. 39, 40 students, please. Yeah, Josh. Josh, we are listening to you. Josh, we can hardly hear you. You have to speak out. It's a platform, so you are not speaking to yourself. Please.
To control means you are comparing something to an established standard.
I don't know if it is my device. Please, can you hear him well on the channel?
No, sir, you hardly hear him.
Yes. So please, we beg you, simply speak out for us. I'm sure if I don't talk well, I don't talk out, what I'm saying will be very boring for all of you. So you try to help us by speaking out. Joshua, do you want to come again? But it's an open question. Anybody at all can respond to it. When you hear control, what comes into your mind? Prince Abu. Prince Abu.
Sir,
Yes, Prince. Respond to the question. Yes, Prince.
Control.
Yes.
You have the power to direct the activities of someone, meaning you have control over the person.
Good. I think he is correct. When we hear control, that's what comes into our mind. Control, subdue someone, power, authority, to direct, to influence. Great. So we're trying to get the meaning of control environment with this understanding. The control environment simply is the totality of the culture that those in leadership, management, is creating for the whole of the organization. Because they are the top of the organization, that's where the control thing comes in. The control environment, the governing atmosphere, the culture that those at the top have created, and that seems to be the culture for the whole of the organization. What is it like? Is it the good one or the bad one? So that's the meaning of the control environment. And as an auditor, you need to know how the control environment is. Is it a bad control environment? Is it a good control environment? So what specific things would you be looking for as a sign of bad or good control environment? Let's look at some of the specific things. I'm just reading from page 170. In fact, the whole lecture on internal control starts from chapter 9, internal control. Yeah, that's where it starts. So you can read again from the textbook. So I'm reading from a table from one of the pages in that chapter about the specific things that go inside control environment. One, communication and enforcement of integrity and ethical values. Do we find that with the top management? Are they the people whose body language, whose word of mouth communicates integrity and ethical behavior? Are they the people who enforce those kind of principles? Yes or no will tell you about whether the control environment is good or bad. Other things that will also define the control environment: commitment to competence, participation by those charged with governance. And this is what that one means: independence from management, experience and stature, extent of involvement and scrutiny of activities, appropriateness of actions and interactions with internal and external auditors. That's the meaning of the participation. The participation by the board of directors, is it the participation that brings success to the organization? Is it a participation which is the right one? For example, they seem to be maintain independence between themselves as board and the management as the people executing the operations of the organization. Are the extent of involvement and scrutiny of activities the right one? So these are some of the things that define their participation. Management philosophy and operating style. Approach to taking and managing business risks. What's the approach to it? Attitude and actions towards financial reporting. Attitudes towards information processing and accounting functions and personnel. That will define the totality of management philosophy. So overall, is their philosophy the anything goes type, or they are the people who wants to make sure that things are done the right way, the way they should be done? That may constitute their management style. Organizational structure should also tell you something about the control environment. Does the organizational structure reveal that almost all powers are wielded in one man's hands, and the structure is not what it is, what it should be? It doesn't meet international, approved standards. All of them will also communicate something about whether the control environment component is good or is bad. Okay, so these are the specific things. Now let's go to what COSO is talking about, the risk assessment component. So we've talked about component 1. Component 2 is risk assessment. Risk is not new to you. So the company can face things that can make it do well, or it can make it collapse. All of such events represent risk. And then we talked about downside risk, upside risk. So go and remind yourself about those things. Because you can never run away from risk. If you are doing business, business goes with risk. It means that every business organization, if not all organization, for every business organization, you should have a system. So we can even add a system, in which case this will be a subsystem. You should have a system that captures these events that will represent risk on the upside or risk on the downside, kind of have evaluation of these events in terms of how likely are they to happen, and if they happen, what is the level of impact. So this system that tries to do what I'm describing right now is a risk assessment system. And the organization should have one as one of the components of internal control system. You should have a system that tracks events representing risk, defines the risks as high risk, low risk, define the impact as heavy or light, however they define it, and continuously update this risk profile. That's a risk assessment system. And if you have one, you are sure to succeed, all other things being equal. If you don't have one, that's a bad thing. So if we know this as auditors, and we go and assess that the organization does seem not to have this, then we know that there's a huge internal control loophole. And that tells you about how susceptible the accounts will be to errors and fraud. And that also tells you how you will have to approach the audit of such a client. So that's the risk assessment system. The next one is control activities. Control activities. In fact, these are the specific policies and procedures that you usually find in our accounting systems. So something like approval systems. You cannot just turn up and go and buy anything just because the office needs it. So some transactions, from a certain amount and above, you can't authorize yourself. You can't sanction the transaction unless a senior person checks it and approves of it. That's an approval control that the organization has embedded in its systems to prevent error, fraud, which will make the company go bad. That's a control activity. Approval policy. Controls over computerized applications. And you can find in computerized applications, you can find a lot of these control activities or procedures. Password is a control procedure or control activity. Providing passwords is a policy. Providing passwords on all computers. Some computers for some organizations are not even made to come with CD-ROMs and other ports. It's just a box, nothing, and it is there. They're all part of the control activities, the way you have chosen to do specific things which you think will prevent errors and fraud, control procedures. Checking the arithmetical accuracy of records, doing something like reconciliations, bank reconciliations, doing something like control accounts. All of these things are control activities or control procedures in the organization. You will see them almost every day in different forms. Something like limiting physical access to certain areas, to certain assets, and to certain records. They all part of control activities or control procedures. So that's what it means when we say control activities or control procedures. Other areas on control activities will be segregation of duties. And that's a very key thing. That's why I'm actually highlighting it. In most small businesses in our country, you wouldn't find most, or at least some of these controls that needs to be in the organization. For example, you go and see in most small businesses that one person initiates transaction and he follows through the process to the end. For example, it is the same person who receives the order from customers buying goods, processes the order, receives the money from the receivables, banks the money, and maybe there will even be no, bank reconciliation. And if there is one, he's the same person who does the bank reconciliation. One person initiates the transaction. Is the same person working everything in between the process up to the end. What do you think will happen with such a situation? What do you think will happen? Are you dozing off?
No, sir, you are not dozing. You are following you.
Okay, so respond. What did I say?
Sir,
Yes, please go ahead.
please, from what you said, because that same person is performing those dual responsibilities, I think it will affect the objectivity of whatever or service that he or she will render.
How? Please, can you break it down a little? How? What you said is right, but it's not too understandable. So I want you to break it down for us to understand it well.
So please, the question that you were saying, I was not able to get what do you call it?
The question well. So
if that's also
okay. So why didn't you ask me to clarify the question? So you were answering the question you didn't understand.
no,
This is what I said. Okay, this is what I said. I said I was talking about segregation of duties generally. And I was just giving, in an attempt to explain what it is, I was giving you a scenario which actually portrays complete lack of segregation of duties. Segregation of duties, when there is complete lack of it, actually means that one person initiates a transaction, follows the transaction through all the processes up to the end. For example, one person receives customers' orders, processes the orders. In fact, this same one person, he is in custody of the inventory, and he does the inventory counting. When customers place order, he bags them by himself. Gives to the customers. When the customers pay, he receives the money by himself. He goes to bank the money by himself. And if there is any bank reconciliation they do, he is the one who does it. And finally tells us, this is the cash balance. What do you think can happen in such a situation? That's the question. You don't get a question?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's be quick. There's no time. Let's respond to the questions quickly. I have asked a question.
Hello, sir.
Any one of you can respond to it. Yes, I'm not making a statement. It's a question.
Hello, sir.
Yes, sir. Edward, go ahead.
Please, I think the one who is taking charge can falsify the records of the documents.
And what can make him do that?
Because it's not under control.
Hello?
Hello, sir.
Come again.
Because,
I didn't hear.
I said that the person can falsify the record or the documents because there's no check and balance. No one is controlling what he or she is doing.
Yes, exactly. So you should have added it initially. When you feel like you can do all things as if you are God, what do you think you will try to do? You even try to go beyond Donald Trump. And try to do the undoable because you have power. When you control a whole system by yourself, everything is under your control. Nobody dilutes your power. And nobody sees your back. Nobody sees what you are doing. By human nature, you can be very terrible. Like you was trying to say, you can decide to, I gave you scenarios. You can decide to steal some of the inventory. After all, he's the only person who takes charge, custody, who watches over the inventory. When people come to buy, he's the one who backs, who prepares the orders. There's no other person who comes to count, to confirm his records. He does them all by himself. So he can steal inventory. He can even sell fictitiously to people who don't exist. All in an attempt to do what he wants to do. Because, like he said, it is not a different person who is going to do the bank reconciliation to spot any mess. It is himself. If he doesn't balance it will definitely balance. That's the kind of thing that can happen. So there's that huge need for segregation of duties as a control activity, very important. It's a very basic thing. So break the transaction cycle will have its logical parts. You can break the cycle into these logical parts, and then you assign people to each logical part so that each person kind of takes over from the other person, which means that person will have to render account. You cannot take over without receiving account from who you are taking over from. So that will serve the purpose of checks and balances, like he said. So that's segregation of duties. Okay, so let's go to the other component. Information and communication. Information and communication. In fact, this is one of the major gaps that, in my opinion, you can find with most of our small and even medium-sized businesses. Information and communication as a component of internal control. Even if they do have that component of the internal control system, you will see it in tatters. It's not in a good form. What is information and communication? Everything we do as a business boils down to information. And in fact, gone are the days when companies high-priced assets, or what companies saw as assets, were huge buildings, mansions, vehicles, machinery. Gone are the days when the concept was like that. The concept of assets now, I mean, the attention, it doesn't mean buildings and the rest are still not assets, but the attention has shifted from physical infrastructure as assets, it shifted to human assets. And in fact, I'm telling you for a fact, it has shifted from human assets to information. Information now is the biggest of assets. Information is even the tool for nations to rule other nations. If you don't have information about how the planet works, what can you do for yourself? You think it takes magic for people to do mobile phone? No. It takes understanding about how the planet works, how the world works. It doesn't take the magic that we have been praying in our churches for. It doesn't take that magic. That's why over many centuries of praying, we still can't do phone. We still cannot do any better thing for ourselves because that's not what it takes. Information. So even as a nation, we have this control gap. But we are talking about businesses. So if you don't have information, you cannot do much. See, the companies that come up with inventions, inventive things, they are the companies that they chase information. They invest heavily in information about just how things work. Most of the companies that sponsor students to do their PhDs in new ways of looking at things, and it becomes what we are reading to you. Information. If America knows about space, on the moon, on all the other planets, and what is there and how it can impact life, and the rest of us don't know, who controls who? That's information. So companies to have a solid information system. And of course, the communication part is that information is not meant to be shelved. Information is communicated. That's why you see it as information and communication. So you should have a system that tracks and disseminates information to all needing parts of the organization. Information is like the oxygenated blood for the company. So you should have a system, like in a human system. If the system that does the job of circulating your body with oxygenated blood is deficient, you will die instantaneously. And that's the same thing that can happen to a company if it doesn't have a good information and communication systems. The information systems in modern terms is more computerized because of advances in computing technology and information technology. But it needs not to be, I mean, when we say information system, it is not only, sophisticated computer systems, rocket science, no. It can be manual system with all the procedures to collect, process, and disseminate information. All information systems used to be manual before. Just that things have changed over the years. So now, at least you will see it as a mixture of some manual parts and computing parts, or totally high-end computer information systems. So that's all about information and communication systems. Any questions so far before we talk about monitoring? Any questions? Any questions? Okay, silence means no question. Now let's talk about monitoring. Monitoring is self-explanatory. If you have a system, to be sure that the system is still the system you intend it to be. In other words, the system continuously works effectively. You need to monitor, because time is a flow concept. Time is like a stream, it's always flowing. So nobody is waiting for you. Events are not waiting for you to do things the way you want them. Things change. And the business world is seriously competitive and seriously dynamic. So you need to monitor how things are changing to realign with the changes. And in most parts, we also lack. And I think I even have to use, I belong to the education institution, so I can use an example from there. I had a cousin who I was trying to actually bring up in my own way. So I used to make him learn a lot of computer stuff. He had his own dedicated computer. And he was schooling at, I think, one of the best junior high schools in Cape Coast, Flowers Gate. So after exam, I think end of term or so, as usual, I would take his report and look at. And even though I was not generally impressed, one thing was striking to me, ICT. Because I expect him to top the class, ICT, because of the investment I do in that area for him. And I saw some low marks. And I was asking and said, I mean, those questions were even cheaper, but he doesn't understand why his grade is like that. So I took the question and went through it, only to realize that there's a huge gap between how we know computer now and the computer things they're making them to do. So now, who will know of MS-DOS? Even as old as you guys are, I'm very sure that most of you have never seen that interface before, so you don't even know about it. Or Word 2003. But surprisingly, those were the things that were in the exam. So even though at home he was learning all the current versions of Windows, current versions of Word and other things, his questions were on lower, very low versions. Most of you guys have not even seen before, let alone him in DHS. So that is what happens if there is no system that that is set up to track how things are changing, for us to update things to keep track with life. So the organization should have a system like that. And a system is always designed to suit just how the operations of the organizations are. Organizations differ. But this is the concept. Have something set up to monitor how things are changing and how we are updating our internal control to live up to the task. That must be there. Okay, so that's the COSO framework of internal control system. It's a system because it has interrelated parts working together to achieve a common goal of providing a reasonable assurance that the entity will be able to achieve its objectives in line with efficient operations, reliable financial reporting, and compliance with laws and regulations. So every organization should have one. And you shouldn't just have it, you should have it in an effective way. It should be doing what it is purporting to do. So the auditor will assess the internal control, will assess each of these components. It will be part of his initial planning, the initial risk assessment. It will form an idea of what all these components, how they are doing. And that will make him have an understanding about the entity as whether it's a high risk or low risk. I mean, in terms of controls, internal controls. If the organization is so high in risk, controls wise and maybe inherent wise, then the auditor may even come to the conclusion that he cannot even audit because the highness can be such that there's nothing you can do at the detection risk side, the auditor side, to bring the overall audit risks to an acceptable level. So internal controls are very important for the auditor. He needs to assess and comes to the conclusion that they are effective. First, and when he comes to the conclusion, it will help him to plan his work. How do I approach this audit? If it is high, very high, and we still have to go and audit, what do I do? At least it will inform you of putting maybe senior, more experienced people there. At least that one will come to you, plus other things. So it helps in planning. It helps in deciding on the approach to the audit. Either you even do what they call substantive procedures as the audit procedures, or you do controls testing. Okay. Then there is some small notes on small companies and the problem of control. And it's mostly about the resources that they need, if not only in terms of cash, also in terms of know-how, so that they will set up effective and complete internal control systems. So internal controls, like I said, are always issues when it comes to small businesses, and most notably in our part of the world. But the question is, with all these beautiful things that internal controls can do, is the conclusion that it solves all problems? No. Internal control system has some inherent weaknesses or limitations, and these are some of them. Maybe not the most important one. This one has to do with cost. If the cost of setting up that effective internal control system will be so expensive compared to any perceived benefits, that may be a limitation. That may not be a good thing about internal control. Another limitation it has is potential for human error. Human beings, they say it is human to err. Let me put it that way. Human beings are going to do the designing and the implementation of the system, of the internal control system. If it is human to err, then they can get it wrongly designed and wrongly implemented. Wrongly designed or wrongly implemented, or both. And that becomes a limitation that will be embedded in the internal control system. Another thing is So when we say limitation, what will not make it effective or what will work against its effectiveness? That's what we are discussing. Human error, so it can be error prone by itself, just by the way it is designed and implemented. Collusion between employees. Controls can be shortchanged. Internal controls can be bypassed easily without the controls noticing anything. It's like controls are sleeping. It's like you have a watchman watching your gate and he's sleeping, so thieves can just sneak in smartly. Collusion can make the same thing happen to the internal control system. For example, if we implement an internal control activity like segregation of duties, which means have the transaction cycle or process broken into logical parts so that separate people are put in charge and one feeds the other, which will require some account rendering as checks and balances. Let's say we have something like that. But all the people on the chain happen to maybe agree to themselves that they should rob the company, steal money, or falsify some records. In that case, who's going to be a check on the other? In that case, it becomes like controls are there, but it's like they are sleeping. So, I mean, the wrong thing can still go without controls, the control system noticing and maybe raising alarm. And that's collusion. That's what we are describing as collusion. The possibility of controls being bypassed or overridden by management itself. Management is the one who sets the controls up. They own it, and it works in their interest. And they are the people at the top. They're the big people. If they themselves are trapping their cash, who will know about it? They will do it in such a way that what they want to do is what they have done. What can you say? They will do it in such a way that you cannot see it. And that one, the internal control system, even though well designed, implemented, will still not be able to do its work. There's a limitation to it. Okay, so basically these are the what you can capture as limitations to the internal control system. Let's talk about the means by which the auditor records control systems, accounting and control systems. We are interested in the control system, so we can drop the accounting. But they can use the same means to record the whole of the accounting system and the controls embedded in the accounting system. Notably, we are going to talk about 4 things. Narrative notes. The records they keep normally is about how they document, how auditors can document the internal control system to see how it works and what is deficient about it, what should have been where it is not, and what are the loopholes. Is there a place where something should have been but there is a gap? The documentation by the auditor of the internal control system can assist. in these revelations. And we'll later talk about those things. So these are the ways they do the recording of the internal control system. By narrative notes, I'm reading this from page 178 of your textbook, Recording, Accounting, and Control Systems. Narrative notes, flow charts, questionnaires, and checklists. These are the means that usually auditors will record the internal control system of the audit client. So narrative notes, I mean, just as it is, narrative notes is just wordy description, explanation about how the system is like. Sometimes with comments about weaknesses, blah, blah, blah. So it's just a wordy way, or, I mean, words describing, explaining what the internal control system is, how it works, what needs to be there, all the things that you want to capture about the internal control system, but with words describing, explaining, with maybe some commentary. That's the narrative note. And that's one means by which auditors can record the internal control system of the client or document the internal control system of the client. And the same thing is there, so sometimes I find it not too useful to read. It's something you can just read. We are not doing comprehension. So you can read about these means by which auditors can record the internal control system. Narrative notes, flowchart, questionnaire, checklist. The questionnaire, there are two types of questionnaire. One which is called internal control questionnaire, ICQ. Another one is internal control evaluation questionnaire. Please try to get the practical understanding to these two, the difference between them. The internal control questionnaire, its main job mainly is to kind of ascertain whether some internal control activity is present or is absent. So there's a design of an internal control system. So through the internal control questionnaire, it's just ask, is this there? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Just for you to know what is there and what is not there. Basically, that's the job it does. The internal control evaluation questionnaire, that one mainly, it's about, it goes a mile in extent. It reviews how effective the existing controls are working, how effective. So it's not just about this is there, this is not there. Also about if they are there, how are they also working? So it's quite a bit extensive than the internal control. You also have to read about the advantages and disadvantages of each of these means. Advantages of narrative, no disadvantages, for example. Advantages, flowcharts, and disadvantages. Flowchart, what is most important is not how you are able to define what a flowchart is and maybe being able to recognize one if you see it. The most important thing is that as students of auditing and accounting, we should know how to prepare flowcharts. We should know how to prepare flowcharts. So that should be one of our focus, learning how to prepare flowcharts so that if you happen to be working for yourself, as maybe trying to do consulting for small businesses, small businesses in the country, they need that kind of service. It's a big gap, a big problem that can be solved for big money. And our graduates, they don't spot it. They are learning for a Bank of Ghana and a GCB. So once you know how to draw one yourself, you can even be studying controls systems, accounting control systems of small, medium businesses, documenting them and recommending improvement and so on and so forth. This is a consulting area. You can go. So begin to care about knowing how to draw or do flowcharts. Also learn about advantages, disadvantages as usual, and about the rest of them. That is just reading, so you have to read them by yourself. Okay, so when the auditor has evaluated the internal control systems, all the components, its effectiveness, apart from what I said earlier, that it informs the auditor about the approach to his own work in terms of, based on his understanding of how risky the client company is. Apart from that, the auditors also do a report on internal control. Most of the time, internal control weaknesses, they find significant internal control gaps, internal control weaknesses. They mostly, as part of their work, document all of, write all of these things down and write a report on them to management. To aid management in improving its systems, its internal control systems. So you have to read on internal control reports. You read it under communication of deficiencies in internal control. You know the internal control report, or reports, simply report to management. That's how they call it. And you get to know about all the stuff about that management report or report to management. All right, okay. Any questions so far? Class, are you with me? Hello?
Yeah, we are with you.
Any questions? Let me get some questions. Let the class be discussive. I am not preaching, please. I am teaching. I'm not even lecturing, I'm teaching. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, let it go. Nicholas.
Okay. Sir, please, I would like to know if you are conducting a research in terms of ICS, will you have to include
what is ICS?
I mean, if you are conducting a research in terms of internal control systems in a particular company,
okay,
will you have to include all the 5 frameworks of COSO in order to be effective, or you can just take about, let me say, 3 or 4 of them and then use it?
That's a good question. Very intelligent question. But let me correct something. You said all the, can you come up again? The first part of your question. Is it all the COSO components? Is that what you said? Nicholas?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. I need to do a bit of a correction.
Yes, sir.
Yes. The correction is that there's nothing like COSO components. It's COSO framework of internal control system. COSO framework, right? And that framework is actually arguing for 5 components of internal control. Because I want you to get the language right. What you said is 100% correct. Just the usage of certain terminologies. Are you okay?
Oh, okay, sir. Yes, sir.
So COSO's internal control framework has 5 components. So his question was, let's say you are appraising the system of internal controls for a particular company. So you kind of do maybe ICQ, internal control questionnaire. You can even do internal control checklists. You can do internal control evaluation questionnaire, whatever. It's a means for you to have an understanding of how the control system is like. His question is, can you single some of the components and forget about others? That question is for all of us, please. So who wants to respond? Who? Okay, maybe you force me to mention names. Rachel. Rachel. Rachel, absent or present?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Rachel. Answer
Sir.
the question, please.
And please, I didn't get the question well.
And you never asked.
Hello, sir.
So if I had not called you, would you
And
have?
please, I didn't get the question well.
The question is this.
Sir, please, the network is not well. It's not stable.
Sorry about that.
Sir, please, the question.
The question is, when you are assessing the effectiveness of the internal control system of a company, can you select some of the components that COSO is proposing, 5 components? Can you decide to concentrate on just 3 and maybe forget about 2? Or you always have to use all the 5? That was a question from one of our colleagues. And we want your opinion on that. I mean, your answer to that question.
Sir, please. In my view, I think all the 5 components will be needed because you can't use some and then leave the rest in order to get an effective work done. Pardon?
Okay, I get you. So the senior who asked this question, are you answered? Senior?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Nicola,
sir.
are you sure you are okay with the answer?
If only is correct.
There's nothing like correct. What we are saying is kind of opinion sharing, and in fact, that's what learning is.
Okay.
All the things you are reading from the book is someone's opinion. You can challenge it. You can begin to think that, no, I think this works this way rather than this way. So she has spoken in her mind about a situation, of course, based on some understanding. So even though the understanding may not be complete now, let's take it to be okay. So that's what he thinks, or that's what she thinks. Does it make sense to you? Based on what you are thinking to ask that question, does it make sense to you?
Sir, the reason I asked this question is that I read a research done by someone.
Sure.
And he included 3 of these frameworks.
I understand when you asked it. In fact, your question was impressive for me. And I linked it sharply to maybe reading some research article. It's not surprising to me you are now adding the details. I understand it. So you go ahead.
So the person included only 3 of the framework. So I was like,
ignore the 2.
Yes, please. So I was like, actually I didn't understand it. So now that we are treating the topic, I was like, okay, then maybe the person's deduction from the research might not be that valid since the person did not include all the 5 frameworks.
Okay. So that's why I was saying that in your own opinion too. When you've seen something, you can judge it against your current thinking, your current understanding of how things should be. You can judge it against it. Rachel did it. She said for her, she thinks when you do it that way, it's not good because there's a framework, and the framework says this is how I define effectiveness. 5 things must be in place working interrelatedly. So it's like saying that, I mean, we define a complete human being as someone with all the physical organs we all know. So if you go and bring someone without a head, would you say it is a complete human being?
No, sir.
Nicholas? Yes.
No, sir.
Because you first defined what a complete human being should be. So anything deficient of that, it will just strike you, no, this is not complete. So what Rachel said is correct. If that is what COSO is saying and we believe in that framework, that's why we are using it. Then they say internal control, if it is complete, first of all, complete and effective, this is how it should look like. And you go and say, okay, maybe I don't want it to look like this. I want it to look like half of what you are saying. Then you don't believe in their framework, then why are you using it? So if that is it, it can be judged as effective only if it meets all the things they have defined as effective. Part of it cannot measure the completeness and effectiveness of the internal control system. And you have chosen to use their framework, which is proposing 5. So your measure using 3, it's just like using a wrong measuring device to measure the wrong item. If you are using, let's say, elastic tape measure to measure maybe some distance, you can never get the correct one because sometimes it stretches up, it stretches down, and so on and so forth. So you use the right device. The device says, yes, 5 components. It is only by using it as 5 components that you can get what the device is proposing you will get. Okay, I guess it should be a good answer to you. Nicholas.
Sir.
Are you okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Any other question? We are wrapping up, please. Any other question? I know you want to go early, so no question. Okay, so just go and do the reading. There is much knowledge left inside the textbook. I mean, inside the whole world. I mean, the textbook is not only way to get the knowledge about what we are doing. So just go and read further about what we have done. In fact, all the things we have done from day 1 up to now. Internal controls in a computerized environment we'll treat it next semester. We want to just shift it to next semester. So this is where we are resting the lecture on internal controls. If you don't have any further questions, then thank you for your attention.
You are welcome.
You are welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.